Hi, and welcome to the Village. I am Lauren Jones, and this is Lily Iserman. I'm filling in for our usual host, Bev Bell, because she is completing her Fulbright work in Kenya right now, and so we send her all the best. And as many of you know, the Village is an online space where educators gather to discuss important issues or topics in the classroom or in the wider world of education. And so our speaker today is Danielle Larkin.
Now that we're done with logistics, we're going to get on to our introduction. So Danielle Larkin is a fourth grade teacher at Maple Shade School in East Longmeadow. She's been teaching for 11 years, and science education is her passion. Danielle has worked within her school to pilot science programming, aligned materials to the 2016 Massachusetts STE, Science, Technology, and Engineering, for those of you who don't know, curriculum frameworks, which are newly released, and assisted in finding resources and training for the implementation of these new standards. It's a lot. As a science teacher, that's a lot. She loves teaching science, has presented her ideas through professional development around the region. Her philosophy around elementary science education centers on the idea that we are teaching students how to be young scientists and engineers, not to simply memorize content, procedures, or scientific principles, which is inspiring to me.
And so now Danielle will ask you to unmute yourself and to turn on your video, and get started.
I'm unmuted, but it won't let me start my video. Oh, there we go. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Danielle, as I said. I'm going to switch over to sharing my screen so that we can get started. And I'm actually going to start us off with a little video clip. So this works out for me. Okay, and so now I'm just going to ask you to, in the chat box, write down 3 words that encapsulate what you just saw. So I'm starting to see some words pop up in the chat box. Lots of scientific words. So a lot of you noticed fire, sound, some words that, were kind of opinions, like if you thought it was cool or interesting. And if you did this kind of work with students, you would see a myriad of different words that the students would come up with. But what I want us to think about, not so much as the science behind what that teacher had there in the clip, but what did you notice about how I started this work with you? And I think for this, you should be able to just unmute your audio and tell me something you noticed about the way I started our session together today.
You jumped right in and showed us something that would catch our attention before you really said much.
Right, and that's exactly what I would like to do and what I would like to see us do in our elementary classrooms, is that rather than having me direct the thinking from the start. It comes right from the students. So the students were able to come up with those words that came right from the students. So all the work in science comes from their curiosity, their wonderings, and then you can kind of bring it from there. So today, as I go through, or tonight I should say, as I go through, I'm going to list 10 things that I do to try and get the work to start from my students' perspective rather than from my own. And then I'll give you sort of opportunities to pop in with the audio like that, or to add things in the chat box as well. And just notice what moves am I making to make the work come from the students or from you in this particular case rather than from the teacher. So one of the first things I like to think about is challenging perceptions in the science classroom of what makes a scientist a scientist. When you ask students this question, what makes a scientist, or what is a scientist, or what is science, they immediately think to some sort of mad science image, or like this young girl in the photo with glass, wearing science goggles, or making potions, or doing experiments. And then when you probe them to think a little bit more, like, well, what else is science? The students often come up with things that they've done in the past as a student of science, which often centers around literacy or reading about science. And so I sort of challenge students in that area, and I'll talk about literacy a little bit further along. But one of the misconceptions maybe that I had as a science student, and even all throughout college, my second major was in science, and I always thought of science as a step-by-step process, a linear step of first you do this, then you do that. I became an expert at teaching the scientific method, and I had great ways for listing all the steps, and I really had that down. And then when the new standards came out and I began to learn more, I began to challenge my understanding of science being such a linear approach. And you'll find this model as a way of showing that science is not a linear approach. It doesn't go step by step. It actually bounces back around and goes, from one thing to another. And there's a video clip that accompanies this that I'll link to at the end if you're interested in learning more about how unpredictable science can be. And so these 8 practices are what I use as the core or the structure of my science curriculum. And then the content, let's say it's sound, like in the first clip, the content just serves as the vehicle. And then the practices are really at the heart of what I do. And this is what I'm trying to develop in my scientists, rather than making them experts on sound or plants or whatever the science content might be. So just either put in the chat box or unmute yourself. What sort of misconceptions either do your students have about scientists, or maybe do you have about being a scientist? Oh yeah, they have to be in a lab. That's a big one. And even the lab coat itself is a big misconception, that you have to be wearing a lab coat. Oh, the gender, that they're men, is a popular misconception. And sometimes I ask students to draw what a scientist is, and they frequently draw male figures in their sketch. Yeah, and that's right. They're definitely not totally objective. Yeah, there's some subjectivity for sure in the realm of science. So I think our students have lots of misconceptions about scientists. I'm just reading this one too. Lab, yeah, that smell, that science is smelly. That's funny. I bet students have that misconception, right? That it's like potions and stinky and gross. But there's so many different aspects to the world of science, and we want to sort of make sure that we develop that in our elementary students. So just be thinking about misconceptions, and that depending on what grade level you teach, you might have an easier or a more challenging job at changing some of those misconceptions. So at the 4th grade level, they're pretty well rooted in what they think science is and what science in school looks like. If you're at a K or a 1st grade level, you have a little more flexibility with challenging some of those misconceptions. So the second thing I do to try and make the work as driven from the student's point of view as possible is that I always introduce the work with really simple concepts. So this school year, I used gymnasium equipment. We had soccer balls, golf balls, tennis balls, and we just used that solely to just explore like scientists. So much in the way I showed you that video, I showed my students this recess equipment, and we played with it, and we bounced them, and we did all sorts of things. And then some work that I've taken from Mount Holyoke in the world of math has been just the simple phrase of what do you notice and what do you wonder? And I use that work in science as well. And then that led us into making all sorts of discoveries about how does the size of the ball change things, how does the weight, and the students all developed their own question of inquiry that we then explored just using recess equipment. And so we just got used to what is a scientist and how it's a little bit messy. Sometimes you have to go back to explore. Sometimes your experiment's not perfect if you were comparing weight of the ball, but then really your balls had different sizes as well. And so it's a little sloppy at the beginning, but they work to refine that a little bit later. And then when I used the recess equipment this year, the students actually told me about this YouTube video where it talks about how things work, and we looked at the inside of a golf ball, and it really just took us to this whole new level of curiosity and just being curious and just coming up with questions and wanting to know more about something as simple as the recess equipment they use on a regular basis. So then you have to think about once it is time to get out of just developing the idea of scientists, you have to think about how can you engage your students in the content. So the recess equipment didn't necessarily connect to my content. It connected to just developing the idea of these 8 practices that we were going to engage in. But then once I pick the content area, I have to pick something that will engage them. So I just put a few examples up here. In 4th grade, some of our energy standards, we use Hot Wheels materials, and there's some video clips which I'll link to at the end too, where you can watch them test Hot Wheels tracks, like real life Hot Wheels tracks. The students are amazed with those videos. They ask you to watch them over and over again. I just want to show you a quick video clip. It doesn't have any audio, but this is one I use to engage the students in what I might consider not as exciting as Hot Wheels or energy, but the idea of erosion. So it's sometimes a little bit trickier to engage students in a topic that might not be as cool in their mind. So here's a little video clip that I share with students, and those of you who are Cape Cod goers would know this as the Beachcomber restaurant. So again, no audio. So if you want to just either unmute yourself or in the chat box, just tell me some things that you noticed about this video clip, or some things you're wondering about the video clip. You can think like yourself, or you can think about what the students might have noticed or wondered, because they sometimes notice things that we might not necessarily expect them to. Yeah, and then they'll wonder, is it going to fall into the hole? Definitely. Other things we might notice and wonder? Yeah, the car. They all want to know about that car, why it was in the parking lot, why there's only one. Oh yeah, and the amount of time that went by in the video. Any other things we noticed? I wonder if I can just pop back up a still of that. And maybe make it a little bit bigger here. And just jump ahead a little bit there. Oop, too far. There we go. Some other things. So one of the other things that the students will notice here, that maybe sometimes adults don't, but the kids will, is the porta potties. They always notice the porta potties. I've done this now with 2 groups of students, and it's like actually one of the first things that they notice. And then they want to know, will the bathrooms, fall in the hole? They always notice those little things. Yeah. Oh, and someone's talking about the construction equipment. They'll notice the construction equipment too. And then when we start to get a little bit more specific, and I've made sure, we've shared out, students will start to notice that there's trees or greenery that's all around this area, but they'll notice that it's not where the hole is or where the restaurant is. And the kids will say, well, yeah, they had to clear it in order to build the restaurant. And the drone itself, some kids will identify that this is a drone video. They'll know that based on the way it's filmed, that it must have been a drone. And that's a whole nother thing to notice and wonder. But here, what I've done with the students is I've engaged the students in a conversation. So during these conversations, usually I'm either quiet or I'm recording their thinking just on a chart on the board, just things that we've noticed and we've wondered. And so I've started the science, right with the students. I've picked something that will carefully engage them in this particular case, it was the science behind erosion. And then I value all thinking. So the porta potties is a totally valid thing to notice. Noticing the drone, even though that's not where I'm headed with this, you want to sort of value that they're curious about it and that they're just, interested about what's happening around them, because that is one of the things that scientists do. And if we look back at those 8 practices, it's one of the things we want to carefully craft in our students. So there's all sorts of ways to engage our students, and I can give some other examples of ways that I've engaged students, but I was thinking that maybe you could think of some of your content areas and think about what are some possible ways that you might engage your students? Like, is there a video clip you could show them? Is there some sort of demonstration or some sort of tool you could show them? And again, you can unmute yourself, or you could just put it in the chat box and I can sort of say some of the things. Yeah, so definitely a text could be something that could get the students to be curious or get the students to be wondering. So we could use a video, we could use a text. Other thoughts about something that might engage the students and let the students, be the ones who are curious from the start? Yeah, so the idea of using a video clip it's not like a how-to video or a this is why things work video. It's just a video clip. And the video clip that Beachcomber restaurant on Cape Cod, I knew that happened because I visited there before, and then I just searched around for a video, and there's also other really cool videos of like homes in California, the beaches eroding. Oh, a real life scenario. Yeah, so like a real problem that's happening in your community or in your classroom. If there's any 5th grade teachers out there, the idea of composting is big in your standards, and that could be something, where you could talk about the trash in your cafeteria just as a way to engage the students. I do agree video clips are really awesome. Some other phenomena that I've used with my students is the Hot Wheels themselves. I'll just pull out a few tracks and I'll pull out a Hot Wheel and I'll drop it down and I won't say anything to the students. And then we'll just talk about what do we see, why would I pull that out? Some other things that I use are if I'm talking about the science of sound, I don't know if you saw a picture there, they're called boom whackers. Our music teacher has them. So I went down and asked her, can I borrow them? Each different stick makes a different sound. If we were in real life, I would have brought things like that for you to kind of play around with. Some other things that I've used to engage my students are just flashlights, mirrors, lasers through a water bottle, and you can see how like the laser will bend when you put it through the water bottle. Just different objects that you might use in the science classroom, but instead of telling the kids how to use it, I just show them something it does, and I ask them what they notice and wonder about it. And yeah, I see someone talking about Hot Wheels. Hot Wheels, I think they still do offer track sets to fourth grade teachers. That's how we all got ours. It was 2 years ago when we were looking at the new standards. They're called Speedometry. It's excellent. I don't necessarily promote certain programs, but that's all totally free, and you can really get the students engaged in the standards. So I just kind of think about how I set this up in my room is that I introduce something phenomenal to the students, a video clip, a tool, an object. I like to use those little solar like dancers, like just a little something that gets them curious. And then this is sort of the trajectory that we take it upon. So I introduce that, we come up with questions, and then I develop learning activities around that. And those are more your standard experiments, except in this case, I have the students developing what they're going to do with the things. So I provide the materials, and the students are the ones directing the activity. They're the ones deciding what to do with it. In the case of the beach on Cape Cod, we ended up calling it the Gap this year. That's what the students called it all throughout our work. The question that I used to guide our discovery was, do mountains last forever? And I didn't introduce that question to them until after I engaged them, until after we did the noticing and wondering. And then that question guided everything that we did after that point. So the students tried to come up with all sorts of ways that might have happened there on the beach, and we ended up modeling it, and I'll talk about that a little bit further. And then I usually like to, after the students have made their discoveries, they're able to claim, what caused that gap on the beach in Cape Cod, and I usually like to end with an engineering challenge, and I'll talk a little bit about how I end with an engineering challenge in a minute. But I also toy around with, should the engineering challenge be at the beginning or the end? And one of the greatest things I think I've done just this school year is I tell students what the engineering challenge will be before we start exploring. So I showed them this video of Cape Cod. We've noticed, we've wondered, we've come up with ways that we're going to try to explain this phenomena. We're going to try to explain how it happened there. And then I tell them, and keep in the back of your mind, what do you think these restaurant owners should do to prevent this from happening in the future? So that's going to be the final engineering challenge they would do when we're all done. So we did that. So one of the fourth things that I do, and I sort of touched upon this a little bit, to try and engage my students and make the learning from them, is that I value all questions. So any question you're wondering, anything you're curious about, we value it, we write it down, and we give it a home, and we honor it. And sometimes we come back to just research it. Sometimes we come back to experiment with it. But then I always make sure that I teach testable questions or driving questions. Sometimes you'll see, so that DQB stands for our driving question board. And the difference between all questions and testable questions or driving questions is that they're questions that are going to move our thinking forward, or they're going to help us discover something new that we didn't already know. And it's not to devalue the other questions. Those might just be Googleable questions. We might just be able to type, those questions in and find a quick answer. It might not be something that's necessarily going to drive us forward in learning something new and developing the skills of scientists. So then the fifth thing that I like to do to make sure that I'm making this work related to the students and related to the students becoming scientists is I like to balance my assessment. So these two questions, if any of you teach fifth grade, know come from the fifth grade science MCAS. And you can use these types of questions, like maybe one or two content specific questions to understand whether or not your students acquired content while you were on this discovery path. But I also like to balance it with questions that come back to the practices. So go back to that phenomena that you showed them at the beginning and ask them questions that are connected to what scientists actually do. So in this case, you can see I showed them a picture of that car down in the beach. And this was after exploration, but our unit wasn't done yet. And I asked them to explain what happened in that picture. So we, at this point, had already figured out that it was a heavy rainstorm, and we figured that out through modeling and discovery. And then I said, well, so what are you still curious about? Because that's one of the skills I want my scientists to be able to do. And then, can you write a new testable question, something else we could go explore? So my assessment looks not only just at content, but at the skills of scientists. And then you saw back there on my trajectory that I usually end with an engineering challenge. And so one of the ways I balance assessment is that the assessment is not just our paper pencil. It's, okay, so now you've made these discoveries. In this case, on the left, they're making solar ovens. And on the right, they built their own flashlights. And then in the middle, the students were building magical wands that were essentially a flashlight. And so these came at the end of units where the students made discoveries about light waves, and they made discoveries about electrical energy. And then we applied those discoveries that we made to building something or creating something that solved a problem. So in the first case, they were solving the problem of we needed to cook our pizza or marshmallows or whatever it was that they had, but we can't use the ovens in our cafeteria because they're no longer functional. So the students developed solar ovens based on what they know about light. And then similarly, after learning about electrical energy, the students built their own flashlights. And that also tied into a unit on renewable sources of energy as well. And then to go along with that work, the engineering work that they do, then I ask the students to, tell me about the thing you designed. And so this is examples of student work where they had to explain the science behind their engineering. So in this particular case, the standard was looking at the flow of energy. And so this student on the right, you can see I put it in darker marker so you could see, but was able to talk about the flow of the different types of energy throughout her flashlight. So I just want to pause here. I didn't put it in the slide for a minute, but maybe in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself. Can you think of some ways that you could balance your assessment, or can you think of some connections to your science content where the students could engineer or create or solve a problem based off of the science that they're engaged in?
All right, well, we'll come back to that. I'll keep going. So the sixth thing that I like to do to kind of do this work with my students is try and make the best of our materials. So depending on where you teach or how long your school has been working with the newer standards, we might be into different worlds. You might have a classroom that's like outfitted with these big science kits, whether they're STC kits or FOSS kits, and they have materials galore with these huge, teacher's manuals that you have to, kind of work through and make sense of. Or you might be in a situation where you have next to no materials and you're finding yourself going to, the Dollar Tree or using recyclable materials. Both kind of work. I think you have to sort of make a blend of them. And if you're in a school that has those big, huge kits, I do have some of those kits. I have the STC kits. They're really not student driven. They're very teacher directed. I give them, if I followed STC the way it was written, I would give them the booklet. They would read the directions. They'd carry out the experiment. They would tell you what they figured out. So take those materials and instead show them, so that kit on the top is a land and water kit, which we have. Instead, I showed them the video from Cape Cod, and then I showed them some of the materials, and I said, well, how can we use these materials to try and make sense of what happened there in the video on Cape Cod? And then the students come up with the ways to use the materials and turn them into the tables that STC had designed. So you're showing the students the materials, you're giving them things to make them curious, you're teaching them how to come up with testable questions, but the students are developing the experiment and figuring out how to make the best of those materials. And then on the flip side, I've had experiences where I've had next to no materials and I have to go to Dollar Tree and buy tubs to turn into land and water tables, or I have to ask parents to send in, recycled materials that we use to build those fans or solar ovens. And one of the best thing about recycled materials is I have like a recycle store in my classroom all year long. It's like 2 big IKEA tubs that are just filled with recyclables. You can just go to it at any time. You don't have to plan ahead or know if you need certain materials. The students have to be flexible with whatever's in that bucket. And it's sort of like a great equalizer. Every family has recyclables that they can donate to the classroom. That doesn't have to be some fancy kit. So I don't know if some of you want to share out about maybe challenges you have with materials. Do you have a ton of materials? Do you have those big fancy kits and you can't really make sense of them or make them student driven? Again, you can type in the chat box or unmute yourself. Yeah, the cost is, like, those kits are just so incredibly expensive. And so that's something I think school districts face a challenge with a lot of times. But one of the things that you can do with those kits is you can usually view them online and you can get an idea for what you have in there. Sometimes the materials that they send you are not that elaborate. They're just Tupperware or scrapers or little cylinders, things that you can, if you sort of build them yourself, get much less at a much less expensive cost. And then since you don't need the lessons, because now the students are the ones coming up with the lessons, you're kind of good to go. Yeah, and then lots of our districts, to kind of level the playing field, will purchase those box programs. And they're great. They do level the, they give teachers something to start with and something to work with. And then maybe after your first year or so, you can start to make it more student driven. So I have a coworker who I'm working with now who, used it for 2 years as the program said, and now we're kind of working together to say, well, now how can you put that in the hands of your students? It does sort of take some time to play around with it. All right, so the seventh thing, I kind of alluded to it before and someone mentioned ELA. I know depending on where you teach, sometimes you might not have any science time. Like there's actually no time in the day set aside to teach science. I've been there and that's very difficult. And where do you get more time? I'm not sure. And sometimes people will say, well, if there's no time for science, just teach it during ELA, just teach it during the literacy block, which is good. And it's, better than nothing. But science is much more than reading about science. So someone mentioned using a book as like a stepping off point, as a phenomena, and that's great. Like it gets the kids hooked, it's in there, but that's not the only way they're going to be learning about science. It's just the thing that's going to get them interested, and then they're developing work from there. So it's hard if you only have that ELA block. It's hard to say, just put it all in ELA, because that's not, if we go back to those 8 practices, the work of scientists. So I use ELA to support my science work, but I usually save it until the end. So after my students have made their discoveries, that's when I then name them and I say, oh, that thing we've been talking about for the past few weeks, the gap at Cape Cod, that was really caused by erosion, and what you just discovered, that big rainstorm that you modeled in your box, that's erosion. Then we read the text on it and they're like, oh yeah, there's that word erosion. It's the thing I just discovered. Now they're talking about it in the book. And they become more engaged in the text because they're making connections like, oh, other scientists discovered what I discovered. Other scientists agree with me that, a big rainstorm would cause that kind of erosion. And they start to see the text as a way to like confirm their findings. Like, yeah, what I did discover is actually true because there's scientists talking about it in their texts. So I try to save the ELA part for the end, and that's when I bring in the books to my guided reading groups, and that's when we talk more about science. And again, resources here can be tricky too, but a short article, I never know how you pronounce it, but Newsela or Newsela ELA has great short articles, definitely ones about many of the science content. You can change the level and you can use that after your science experiment. So how have you previously taught science vocabulary, or how do you use science vocabulary? Would it be a shift for you to save the science vocabulary for naming the students' discoveries rather than introducing the science vocabulary first and then doing the experimentation. So again, if you want to type in the chat box or unmute yourself to tell me about how do you teach science vocabulary now, or how might you proceed doing it differently? Yeah, so I think Sarah mentions connecting this to how she teaches math, and I think that's really inspired what I do as a teacher. I don't like pre-teach math vocabulary and then we explore it. It's just the opposite. We explore, we make discoveries, and then I name it for them, and it just seems to stick so much more because they have ownership of it, they've made sense of it. It's theirs now, rather than this word the teacher put up on the board and, told everyone the definition of. Another thing that I've actually done, sort of inspired by a student, when I put the vocabulary up, I wrote the definition there, and where I got the definition, maybe from my book or from Google or wherever. And one student sort of critiqued a definition that I wrote up there, and it was a pretty valid critique. It didn't exactly cover the meaning of that word. So now we've taken a liking to critiquing other people's scientific definitions based on what they've discovered. So the next thing that is really important when you're doing student-led science work, when the students are coming up with the questions, when the students are deciding how to use the materials, is to be flexible. Some middle school or high school teachers might be appalled at some of the things my students are exploring or trying to make sense of, but they're young. They're only in 4th grade, so we have to be, we've got to remember that. On the left, you can see a picture there of a straw kazoo. I don't know, we were exploring sound, and the student came up with a question. I had straws that looked much like that. She wanted to know how the color would affect the sound that it made. And I sort of thought, like, do I let her explore that? Like, the color is not going to make a difference in terms of the sound. And I almost told her, like, no, you can't. But then I thought, no, I'll just let her figure it out. And she did figure it out. That the color indeed made no change on the sound. But later we went on to study light waves, and lo and behold, color does impact things. So she was identifying a property, which is an important skill for a scientist, and she identified that property didn't make a difference in the world of the sound. So just being flexible with what questions the students might come up with. Students also thought, if I go back to that picture from Cape Cod, that it was an earthquake. They said it was an earthquake, and the earth opened up. They had the earth opening up, they had that connected to earthquakes in their mind all the time. And I thought, do I let them explore earthquakes? Do I let them? And I said, you know what? Scientists sometimes do a little research. Let's research if there's ever been any earthquakes on Cape Cod in the last 2 years. And we found out, no, there haven't been. So it couldn't have been an earthquake that caused that gap. Other students thought it must have been a hurricane. So we simulated a hurricane. They got a hairdryer and they made waves and wind, but it didn't turn out to be a hurricane either. So that kind of took a different direction. I didn't think we were going to talk about earthquakes or hurricanes, but we did. I let them explore it, and then I kind of brought them back to the work we were doing with weathering, with erosion, excuse me. It can be tricky because students aren't really used to this freedom of thinking. They're used to being given answers and being told what science is and this is how it works. So you have to be flexible with them a little bit too, and with their parents too. The parents might not quite see where you're heading with it or where you're headed with it until you get there. So we just have to be flexible with this work. And then as the students are sort of embarking upon this journey, try to keep track of their change in thinking. This is an important thing that scientists go through. Our thinking is constantly changing. We have something new to investigate, where we have evidence that supports that idea or doesn't support this idea. And so this is a series of questions that I borrowed from someone I led another course with from Amherst Public Schools, Jetta Hughes, and I have it just posted in my classroom on little sleeves, and the students jot down their thinking as they go, and that lets me keep track of where students are, because one group is investigating if it was a hurricane that caused the erosion, the hurricane that caused the gap. Another group is testing whether it was oil. I had a group who thought it was oil from the car, so they were testing oil. So just kind of keeping them all on track and watching their thinking change. This is kind of a neat way to do that. And I know this particular teacher had them on posters, and each student would keep track of the posters. So that brings me to my last thing, is that we need to remember that they are young scientists, they're young engineers. If you look at those 8 practices, they grow with them throughout middle and high school. And so their expectations in elementary school are not nearly what they are in the middle and high school. And they're going to make mistakes, and they may even develop a little bit of a misconception about science along the way. But then when you go to read about it, they'll say, why am I not reading about this thing that I thought was true? So just keeping in mind that they're young, and sometimes you might have to even remind other people who might come in to observe your classroom that they're young. They might not have mastered it totally yet, but they'll get there. And then connected to them being young, we want to remember that science stems from curiosity. Children are naturally curious, and science is just an extension of this curiosity. I've been doing a lot of reading and research on how science can, how schools can kind of suck the creativity out of students. And we want to sort of shift that we want school to be a place where students ask questions rather than always get answers. And that can be a hard shift, like I said, depending on where in elementary school you're teaching. I'm going to show you just a short little video clip. This is with Bill Nye and President Obama. And there's like one little part that I want to sort of highlight about student curiosity and teaching science in schools.
Bill Nye, back from our trip to Florida. The president and I had a very nice conversation about climate change, science education for girls, and especially the future of the U.S. As a guy born in the U.S., as a patriot, I'm just delighted that we are all working together really at last on addressing climate change so that we can, dare I say it, change the world. Check out our conversation.
All right, we ready? When we decided to take action, when the Clean Air Act passed, when Clean Water Act passes, when the EPA is empowered, it turns out that we can solve these problems. But the danger is that we then take it for granted. Scientific literacy generally, and encouraging young people to be excited about science. You're the science guy. This is your demographic.
These are my people.
These are your peeps, as they say.
Yeah.
You're focused all the time on getting young people excited about science. What have you learned about what works, and why do you think it is that our schools are not more successful in getting kids excited about science, technology, engineering, math, particularly when it comes to girls, but also when it comes to African Americans, Hispanics? Where do you think things are breaking down? Because kids naturally are curious. They love tooling around and figuring stuff out. What happens?
Well, our problem, you have to invest in science education, and the very compelling research. 10 years old is about as old as you can be to get the so-called lifelong passion for science. And it seems to me it's about as old as you can be to get a lifelong passion for anything. Right. Like, when did you want to lead and change things?
I might be. I was kind of a late bloomer. I think it wasn't until I was like 45 I decided I was going to do something with my life. But
Really?
No.
What's next?
So politics aside there, 10 years old for the lifelong passion for science. And so that part of the video sort of always sticks out to me as something I have to keep in mind in my classroom, that 10 years old is when we want to build this passion. So I'm just going to close out, and then we'll have time for questions with my inspiration for much of the science work I do in my classroom has come from Twitter. I've been in a little bit of a Twitter lull these past couple months. School's been very busy, but my suggestion for you is to get on Twitter, and I have some really cool science people that you might follow. I actually cited some of them in the presentation because some of these ideas came from science teachers who I've never actually met, but I've met them virtually through Twitter. So I'll get you these links too, and then some of the other things that I cited will be on that link as well. So I think if you have any questions, you can send them now. And then maybe I can type that link right in the chat box, actually. So that link has a lot of the resources that I use. So the Cape Cod lesson, I kind of left out the in-between, right? So the Cape Cod lesson so they watched the video, they noticed, they wondered, and then we used the stream tables from the STC kit, which are essentially a Tupperware with dirt in it and a little hole at the bottom to drain the dirt out. And the students all explored their theories. So they thought it was oil, they thought it was a hurricane. Those didn't work out for us. So then they thought, oh, maybe it was rain. So we modeled rain with a soda bottle and like a little, I'm forgetting the word, but a little sprinkler on the top that sprinkled the rain out. That didn't really do it. We had to do 2 full water bottles full. So they came up with the discovery that it must have been caused by a heavy rainstorm. And then there's another video online where a news reporter actually says, heavy rainstorm causes erosion on Cape Cod. And then it went back to the video. We watched it again, and that's when they noticed all the green plants, and we planted plants in our stream table, and we saw how that affected erosion, all towards that end goal of trying to prevent the restaurant from falling into the ocean. The students designed a final stream table where they built fences, they planted grass, they tried to get the slope out of the land, and then they wrote the restaurant owners a letter on what they should do to fix their restaurant. And writing definitions with the students. I sort of started that work this year. Like I said, I was posting definitions up, and then one girl was like, I don't really like the way that's worded. And so we started kind of just crossing it out with a Sharpie marker and rewriting it the way we thought was better. And the rigid administration, I think, can be tricky. Like I said, sometimes my own principal, he's very supportive of science, but he'll come in and the kids they'll be a little foggy about what they're trying to do, and he will try to like tell them, and I'm like, no, don't tell them that yet. They'll figure it out. So I don't know. I think my advice is that if you have research and you're really well versed in why you're doing what you're doing, I think that your administrator just naturally has to support it because they want what's best for children. And I think if you go back to those 8 practices and you say, I'm really trying to develop these 8 practices as opposed to just making them, understanding just content, I think they can't argue with something that works and is good for students. And the time is always the trickiest thing. Like I said, my principal is very supportive of the sciences, and so we have a minimum of 45 minutes a day dedicated just to science. But I would say this work could be done to different degrees. If you only have like a half an hour once a week, or if you have an hour once a week, you just wouldn't be able to cover as many content areas or get as in depth. You might have to reveal some things to the students rather than letting them fully discover everything on their own. You might have to let them do one experiment and then go into reading a book rather than letting them experiment multiple times. I always have trouble with the multiple iterations, especially when it comes down to that last engineering challenge. Time is just something we don't ever get more of, right?
Well, thank you so much, Danielle. And thank you to the audience for those questions. That was awesome.
And so we just want to thank you again. And if no one has any more questions, I think we will wrap up for the evening. So we also wanted to thank all of you for being really engaged and active participants this evening. And we hope that you are all able to join us for our next session.
Our season finale.
Yes, our season finale of season 1 of The Village. And so we hope you all have a fantastic start to your week.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.